Faza'il A'maal, More Trouble Than It's Worth, Part 14, Extensive Use of Weak Hadith, and Imam Suyuti's Influence.
Faza'il A'maal, like Maulana respected Maulana Ibrahim Sahib, the very learned Maulana Ibrahim Sahib said earlier, that after the Quran, amongst the Muslim population, after the Quran, Faza'il A'maal is the most widely read book. The most widely read book, alhamdulillah. It has been widely accepted by the Muslims. Inshallah, over the course of the next hour, we will be looking at some allegations and some objections.
In a previous episode, I detailed exactly how Imam Suyuti categorized authentic, good, and inauthentic ahadith, sahih, da'if, and hasan hadith, and how Imam Sheikh Zakaria had actually copied Imam Suyuti in his categorization, and how this led to problems when it came to categorizing hadith. It wasn't only in the use of symbolism that Sheikh Zakaria copied Imam Suyuti. He also borrowed heavily from a book of his called Jama as-Saghir, and this is what the author says in the thesis that serves as the backbone for this whole series. This is page 257. He says, "We can say that the weak hadith in the book, few or many, or whether or not the author knew of their weakness, do not pose a problem for the author." Why? Because he believes in using weak hadith for Faza'il A'maal. But then he says, this is likely to lead to leniency in mentioning very weak ahadith. So the important point here is, because he uses so many weak hadith, the tendency is to use very weak hadith. And from among the conditions of using weak hadith is, number one, it should be stated that the hadith is weak. Number two, it should not contradict anything else that's present within the Shari'iyah. And number three, it shouldn't be very weak. And this condition, this third one, is the one that's the issue here. And also on this page, he says, in the study that he's concluded, there are 20 extremely weak hadith found in the Fada'il of Namaz. So in one book alone, one sub-chapter alone, there's 20 extremely weak hadith. And in the footnote number 28, the author has cited this hadith in the commentary of his book without quoting the source or mentioning the narrator at all. So compounded weakness, compounded ignorance, and this is why we do not trust this book. Another interesting part of this thesis is footnote number 372, and this is well worth a read. And this is talking about the book of Imam Suyuti, Jama as-Saghir, and basically it was criticized for having a lot of weak hadith. And there is a modern day scholar, his name is Muhammad Nasiruddin Al-Albani. He concluded that the weak ahadith amounted to 6,450 out of 14,652. That's 44% weak. So 44% of the hadith in Jama as-Saghir are weak. And other scholars like Ahmed ibn Siddiq al-Ghumari, he said that the fabricated hadith reached 456. So that's not weak hadith, that's fabricated, totally fabricated. That's 3% are totally fabricated. And then this is Dr. Turkistany's analysis. This is a big number indeed. And here the footnotes are mentioned for where you can find those sources. So clearly, Sheikh Zakaria bases his sources upon very weak, and if we to believe Siddiq al-Ghumari, fabricated foundations. Enough with the FA, enough with the TJ. Now we continue the fantastic work of Scott Lucas, and let's see what Scott Lucas says about dictionaries. So here is a chapter, or part of a chapter, and he talks about hadith rijal literature. He says, What is Sunni Islamic Hadith literature, to be exact? This literature consists of three major genres of works, and this is what I'm trying to impress upon the audience. Hadith collections, so we've got the 6 canonical hadith collections: Bukhari, Muslim, Abu Dawood, Ibn Majah, Nasa'i, At-Tirmidhi, and you could add others to that, like the Muwatta of Imam Malik. So that's the first genre. The second are biographical dictionaries of hadith transmitters, Ilm al-Rijal, and Dr. Turkistany called it Hadith al-Rijal, or Rijal al-Hadith. And then elaborations of hadith disciplines, Ulum al-Hadith. And then he quoted a scholar that I've quoted before, Muhammad Zubair Siddiqui, gives one of the few useful books in the English language. I've given you more than one. I've given you I'll give you about 20 different useful English books for you to read and make up your own mind. Further on page 17, Dr. Lucas also mentions the following. He says, the fundamental Sunni position with regard to the didactic authority of all Sahaba is articulated and explained. Finally, we show how Ibn Salah's entire systematic categorization of the hadith disciplines demonstrates the fundamental role of Ilm al-Rijal. So not only is it Dr. Turkistany's position that Ilm al-Rijal is important, not only is it Scott Lucas's contention that it's important, or any hadith scholar worth their salt. Here is a early hadith scholar called Ibn Salah. Just his categorization shows how important Ilm al-Rijal is. He says it has an irreplaceable significance, the irreplaceable significance of the hadith transmitter criticism in the venture of Sunni hadith scholarship. So I can't impress enough upon you how important Ilm al-Rijal is. And here, just for your education, I give you Ibn Salah's, or part of Ibn Salah's categorization of Ulum al-Hadith, and he's talking about arts and techniques of hadith transmission, and then this bit which is in Roman numeral 5, the classes of the transmitters, the Sahaba, the Tabi'un, who are the followers of the Sahaba, the Thiqat and the Du'afa. Thiqat means reliable, Du'afa is plural of Da'if, which is weak. The Thiqat, who were Thiqat, they were reliable but they made errors. And the Tabaqat of scholars. Tabaqat means generations of scholars. Then he goes through types of transmission. Clearly, the venture of Sunni hadith scholarship holds Ilm al-Rijal in a very high rank. Please stay tuned for many more parts.